Hello, everyone, and apologies for the delay here. I'm Julius Krein, editor of American Affairs. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this discussion on housing policy and the American family. To me, it's a topic that represents a surprising blind spot, perhaps. On the one hand, on the Democratic Party, or at least certain quadrants of the Democratic Party, housing affordability, land use reform, zoning reform, um, building more residential units has become a primary topic of conversation. Perhaps the only topic of conversation, it can seem sometimes, in the policy discussion. And yet, to take a somewhat uncharitable reading, but perhaps not totally unjustified, one hears very little discussion of the family in those housing conversations. One can be forgiven for thinking all of the focus is on professional class, single people in big cities. At the same time, Republicans still love to talk about the family, but when it comes to issues of housing affordability, which is certainly a growing problem and issue for many families, they don't seem to hear much in the way of solutions. And indeed, we invited a number of elected officials to join this conversation from both parties, and got a lot of responses of that's really interesting, but I've never really thought about that before. Don't have much to say about that right now. So hopefully, this discussion can open up a new area of study, of policy discourse, and hopefully even some solutions. So I'm very pleased to welcome for this first panel on the economics of housing and families, three panelists: Lyman Stone from the Institute for Family Studies, Brian Asquith from the Upjohn Institute, and Philip Pilkington dialing in from Europe from the Danube Institute in Budapest. So with that, we've taken up plenty of time already, so why don't we just get started here? Before getting into the specifics of housing and family economics, maybe it's helpful to lay some foundations on demographics and what actually are we talking about when we talk about families today. So um, thank you. Sorry about the Zoom issues there, Lyman, but I know you've done a lot of work on this. Maybe you could lead us off on some of the changing demographics of the family and the implications for housing in 2025.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm sorry about a Zoom hiccup. I don't know exactly what was going on, but so I mean the basic when we talk about family 2025, the big thing we're ultimately talking about is that people are marrying less, marrying later, and as a result, having fewer children. There's more people who are single, unattached, and fewer people having kids. Obviously, this has lots of consequences for society in many areas, um, and has a lot of different causes as well. But it is both cause and consequence of things we observe in American housing. It is a consequence um, of housing because we know that marriage decisions and fertility decisions are really closely related to residential housing choices. Um, and it's also a cause of housing dynamics in that how people arrange themselves in families, in couples, affects the kinds of houses that they want and that they need. So, I mean, obviously in the US, the most salient element of this is just that fertility is at record lows, and that marriage rates are also, depending on how you measure them, very close to record lows. So when we have record low rates of family formation, and we know that family and housing are closely connected, we immediately want to know, well, is there something happening in housing that's influencing these family outcomes?
Brian, any thoughts here?
Yeah, I've seen many of the same things that Lyman is seeing, and I agree with all of them. I think what I would add to it is when you sort of put all these pieces together, what it sort of translates into is the number of households has really increased much faster than total population. If you go back to like 1960s, for the middle of that post-war boom, the US population was about 180 million. Now it's about 331 million. So that's a little bit under, increase, a little bit under a doubling. But the number of households has increased by 150%, much faster than the total population, just because sort of mechanically smaller families, later coupling means you just have a lot smaller household sizes. And in fact, household sizes have shrunk by about 25% over the same period. So it kind of means that there's been a lot of additional pressure put on the housing stock, sort of above and beyond what you would get from just like pure mechanical increase in the population. And obviously I think what Lyman is saying, and I agree with this, is sort of a, co-determined relationship between how difficult it is to get a house and how likely are for a family and have kids. But some of the pressure comes the other way, like sort of the big fall in marriage rates and the big fall in fertility has happened quite some time ago. And as it sort of works its way through the system, I think it makes it harder to stage a recovery because of these sort of older people who, long ago didn't get married or long ago didn't get divorced, and they each individually need their own house, or often they have their own house, and they have sort of a lifetime of credit history behind them, and it makes it much easier for these sort of older individuals now 50 years into the sexual revolution to sort of have these single family homes that might have been occupied by younger people. So there are a lot of complex dynamics here at play. And it makes, maybe one of the reasons that policymakers, Julius, when they reach out to you, so they hadn't really thought about it much, is because, these complicated intergenerational dynamics sort of aren't much discussed and sort of are beyond the usual policy issues that they're really thinking about.
Philip, do you have anything to add on this before we move on to specific housing issues for families?
Well, I think I have a pretty controversial view on this, actually. I'm pretty skeptical of the supply and demand argument for housing. I don't think it fits with international data, and I think fitting it to national data is pretty hard too. It's a meme that's going around for sure. We could talk about why it's going around, but we won't. But there's not a great deal of evidence to this, statistical evidence. And if you look at the statistical evidence, it seems to point in the other direction. I think the demographic changes are actually the thing causing the high house prices. I think people are increasingly viewing housing as an asset through which you milk investment income, rental yield, as you call them in investment markets. And basically, what's happening is very large pools of capital are accumulating due to an aging population. People, it's the standard life cycle model in economics. Capital accumulates as people age. The capital has fewer and fewer places to go. I mean, we had low interest rates, really low interest rates since 2008. So you can't get a good yield on your bond. So that led to people reaching for yield in the stock market. And they did for a while. And they bid up price to earnings to like nosebleed levels, close to 2000 dot-com bubble levels. And so financial advisors started telling people to pile into bricks and mortar. I mean, I saw this when I used to work in the investment industry. And all you have to do is go and Google investment firms, private equity firms focused on real estate, and you'll get a very, very good sense of what's going on in the housing market. So I actually think the aging population is the thing that's driving the housing prices up. That doesn't necessarily mean that they'll stay up because they've turned it into a financial asset, to my mind. And if they've done that, you'll get the same rockiness, volatility, and roller coaster dynamics that you will in equities, for example, which is exactly what I expect to happen. And it's what we saw in 2008 as well. So I think there's actually a direct link here. And I guess the kind of negative aspect of that is that the policy is a lot harder. It's not just like deregulate zoning laws or whatever the YIMBY creator is saying. So it's more complicated, but it's also massively ironic because it's like the demographic problems are both causing, if I'm correct, the demographic problems are both causing the high house prices and the high rent prices, and they're also squeezing young families out of the market, thereby making the demographic problems worse. I mean, it's a theory, but I think it better fits the data than the supply and demand argument.
Now let's maybe try to dig into that a little bit more, because people rightly point to some data that show, in areas where they're building more housing, house prices or rent prices are a bit lower than in areas with much less new construction or whatever. But at the same time, basically the valuations of every single financial asset are up a lot, whether it's stock, PEs, um, agricultural real estate, other forms of real estate, gold, Bitcoin, whatever. And so even if you want to say that in some areas, the average house is six times the median income rather than seven, there's still a lot more than, the three times it was back in the 1960s or whatever. Um, but I wonder if there's some additional, in theory, that should also be stimulating a lot more investment into these assets. But it's not. And I mean, Philip, you just wrote a piece in American Affairs talking about how housing and healthcare and some other things, but housing being kind of the big one, has just sucked up more and more of individual income. So kind of looking at this from the income level as opposed, maybe from the asset valuation level or whatever. What do you think is going on in housing in general? And what, if anything, is differentiating some of the single family or family home issues? I know, for example, that it was a stated strategy after the housing crisis in 2008 when the rental kind of institutional investor driven single family home portfolios would bought them up and rent them out. They were targeting families with children because it's much harder for those families to move, and they would absorb an 8-9% rental increase rather than pull their kids out of school or whatever. So maybe we could just dig a little bit deeper on the housing as financial assets before we get into some of the other policy discussions.
Well, I mean, what I was writing about in that essay is basically that the too long didn't read version is living standards have gone up massively, but the actual stuff that we're spending money on is kind of the same as it was in like 1970s or 1980s. We all have our washing machines, et cetera, et cetera. And what's actually happening is two sectors are just sucking up more of the income. One of those sectors is edu health. It's actually called that in the statistics. The statisticians are onto something there. And the other sector is rent or owner's equivalent rent or whatever. So it's like rent or mortgage payments or whatever, and that's a reflection of the high price to income ratios in housing markets. That is the price you pay for a house relative to the amount of average earnings or whatever that you have. So I think this is just like more developments in financialized rentier capitalism, where you're increasingly trying to find areas to extract rent out of. We see this absolutely everywhere. I saw recently private equity moved into campsites and jacked the prices because when you have financial capital move into these places, the markets stop acting like a normal market. They act in a monopoly manner, and as anyone who's taken an economics course knows, in a monopoly scenario, you're able to raise prices until the market screams. So until like the people physically can't afford the product, right? If it's a necessary product. And that's exactly what we see in housing. Tell me that isn't what rent prices look like. Rent prices look like what you would charge the average person without pretty much bankrupting them, right? I mean, that's effectively looks how rent prices are set. Not just in the United States. It's the same in Britain. It's the same in Ireland. It's the same in various European countries. So I think that's basically what's going on. But this is happening in all sectors of the economy. And I think like economists kind of know these dynamics. They're like simple monopoly dynamics. They're pretty easy to model. They're pretty well known. They've been known since the 1930s. But we're not applying them in these markets. And we're saying, well, it must be some sort of function of demand or something like that. Just quickly on the studies that have come out showing this, I can't remember off the top of my head, but the one statistical study that was done showed something like a 10% increase in building, like construction, led to a 1% fall in rent. I mean, first of all, if that's statistically significant, if it is genuinely causal, that's ridiculous. That means you have to increase by 50% building to bring down rent prices by 5%. And then the other big shot example was Austin, Texas. But what happened in Austin, Texas, everyone knows in financial markets, money flowed in there when Elon Musk said he was going to move Tesla there. The hipster money flowed in. And then when that all fell apart, the hipster money flowed out. And there was a building boom, of course, because the money flew in. So they're confusing a micro housing crash in Austin City with supply and demand dynamics. But basically, I think that's what's going on. I think that we're at a point now where there's so much financial capital floating around that the capital's reaching for yield anywhere. When that hits the housing market, it turns into a simple monopoly dynamic. Just do the model. You assume one, it's a necessary good. Okay, so inelastic demand, relatively inelastic demand. Pop that into a monopoly model, and you'll just get maximum, you know, up to budget breaking levels, and then that's what you'll charge. And of course, anyone that's ever paid rent in a major city knows that's exactly what they're paying. You can't save if you're living in a major city. So everything in my opinion points to this dynamic. Just one last thing on that. It's happened all over the world. Are we really to believe that all these countries at once experience some sort of zoning crisis? Like all these jurisdictions between 2011 and today just experienced the same crisis in zoning restrictions at the same time. It's weird. It's a weird argument if you think it through. So I think that's basically what's happening. And as I said, this makes policy for it a lot harder, and it'll also make the politics around it a lot harder because you won't necessarily, there are ways to do this, but you won't necessarily have the building lobby on your side.
Well, I want to do another conference soon on the definition and implications of hipster capital. But in the meantime, like to continue digging into to this issue because housing has been a financial asset for a long time, but it also hasn't behaved quite like this, you know, throughout history. Brian, I mean, you know, Philip gave some pretty strong views there. Feel free to respond to whatever you'd like, but I know you've done a lot of work on the aging of the housing stock and you know the kind of remnants of the post-war building boom that we're dealing with today. And I'd be curious your thoughts on how you think that feeds into all this.
Yeah, I would just say that it could be that it works out the way that Philip describes. I could easily see a lot of forces pushing the opposite way, in part due to sort of the actual composition of the housing stock, as you were just sort of alluding to. To me, like perhaps housing will increase, more speculation. Could be the opposite. Consumption of housing becomes more important to people. Secure consumption of housing becomes more important to people as they get older, which is why you see a big increase in retiring in place, which I think is actually one of those things that's sort of depressing the sort of supply of housing for younger people. There both the fact that population is aging and the fact that families are smaller means that, one of the ways that I could sort of safely speculate in the past on housing is, okay, I have 3 kids and they have grandkids and I have all this capital, but like, if my speculations go bad, I can go move in with my kids. But if I'm like 75 or 70, and sure, I might have a pool of capital, but if I don't have any kids or I have only one kid, then like if my speculation goes bad, my backup options are going to be the nursing home. So I'm not as sure as Philip is that we're about to see a big boom in speculation, housing due to aging. Interest rates are probably going to be higher for the foreseeable future than they were in the past. That big global baby boom that was sort of driving demand or driving generation capital and demand for bonds is sort of going to start recessing. So interest rates probably be higher. Really, only American boomers had a good number of kids, and boomers in most other countries did not. So there's just not going to be a big working age population in a developed world that will sort of drive down demand. So instead, I think more about these other issues, that are sort of bottlenecking supply here in the States. Of course, you're right. Like, it is strange that so many places all in the same time have had this like big run up in the price of housing and across all these different legal systems. It has been worse in the Anglosphere than other places. I think that is a common factor. And that is a common factor that there's sort of this common law approach to sort of zoning regulation, to resolving property disputes, that does seem to be acting as a bottleneck or is coming up the process. But here in the States in particular, you do have this sort of situation where, the national median age of a house is 40, but like in the Northeast, the Midwest, California, it's much older. If you want, like if you are 25, 28, you want to buy a house, even if there's one available, and even it matches your income specifications, and you have the right credit score and everything, you're very likely your starter home is going to be post-war. At this point, a lot of these buildings are older, as I agree with Phil that sort of expectations have risen for, compared to the post-war world of what sort of constitutes a proper home. But there are a lot of people whose best opportunity for a $200,000 home is going to be something built in 1950 that's going to be 1,500 square feet, aging roof, aging heating system, may not have any kind of cooling system at all, might have asbestos, might need lead remediation. There just are not a lot of uh, programs. There are programs sort of help people get in the home of their first-time home buyers. There's no program or very few programs to help people sort of make these kinds of homes attractive. So I think that like this, I do think the supply problem is real, and I think that it might play out differently in other places, might be different causes in different places. But I think that thinking through that just sort of matching problem, it makes it very hard to escape the conclusion that there is some sort of fundamental supply problem for these kind of entry-level homes for young families.
Lyman, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's not just the housing stock that's gotten older, it's the homeowners. The average age or the median age at first home purchase is simply going up and up and up and up. It's rising faster than the median age in general is. And if you look at like the price of housing, like Philip talked a lot about how expensive housing is, that's actually not true for everyone, right? So the price of a median home compared to the income of a 55-year-old has not risen over the last 50 years. Okay. It's only if you compare it to the income of a median 30-year-old or 35-year-old or 25-year-old. Okay. What's actually happened is, and also if you just look at the share of the housing market made up of buyers who are like over age 50, it's just skyrocketing. So what's going on in the housing market um, is, in my view, simply that, why don't we have starter homes? Because very few home buyers are starters. Okay. A larger and larger share of homes are to people who are not first-time home buyers. Um, and this is basically a demographic fact, right? That you just have an aging population with a lot of older people. They kind of set the tune for the housing market. They have a lifetime of savings. They can bid up prices. I don't know if you want to call this financialization or whatever. I don't really think that you can use a monopoly on a model on this. The biggest real estate holder in the country has like 0.2% of housing. That doesn't sound like a monopoly to me, but regardless, at the end of the day, what you do have is a market where builders kind of have to uh, the flows are very small compared to the stocks, right? Like the total amount of housing you add each year is a very small share of the market. Most of the market is just stuff that was built when people thought it was a good idea for the needs of the past, right? And as a result, yeah, you're going to have a lot of mismatches between the types of houses people want, the types that are available in the places that they want to live. That's going to be a durable feature. And that is especially going to be a feature at times where you have huge mismatches in cohort sizes. And we live in such a time where we have a huge retiring baby boomer cohort going through one set of transitions, and then a relatively large sort of, 30 something cohort as quote unquote millennials are reaching these ages. And it does create a particular kind of moment where any latent constraint in the market will have outsized effects. For example, if, as Brian said, you are part of an Anglo common law program country, right? So Japan doesn't have the run up in rents the way we see. France doesn't have the run up in rents that we see. Germany doesn't have this. Yes, prices are up some, but nothing like what we see in the Anglosphere countries that all share a legal system and to some extent, a higher correlation in historic demographic trends and cohort sizes than a lot of these other countries, partly due to historic openness to immigration. Um, Regardless, the result is that, yeah, we do have a real supply constraint issue, not because supply is the only causal factor, supply or supply constraints, whatever, they're not. Demographic facts matter. Yeah, maybe entrance of various pools of investment capital matter. That's totally plausible to me. Um, but at the end of the day, supply constraints are the lever you can actually grab. And they do something, which is why we know that the map of the places that are most expensive for young people to live in, that is where homes are most expensive relative to like the incomes of like a 30-year-old, is just a map of places with really restrictive zoning. Like they're just the same map. And it is not a map of population density. It's not a map of income generally. There are high-ish income places where houses are not terribly expensive with respect to young adult earnings. So supply constraints matter. We also know this from a small but growing pool of like quasi-experimental studies that look at what happens to housing costs when you change zoning. And the answer is they fall below prior trend and construction expands. Philip mentioned, yeah, if you increase construction 10%, maybe you get 1% cheaper rent. That's actually a very big effect since increasing construction 10% means increasing the total stock of housing by less than 1% in most cases, which means less than 1% increase in the housing stock gets you about 1% decrease in rents. That's a very high elasticity. The fact that construction is a small share of stocks is kind of the fundamental math problem here. But at the level of flows, it's quite a high elasticity because new construction is a disproportionate share of houses that go on the market, obviously. So because of all that, I think we should think about supply constraints. Um, I think it's particularly striking that a lot of people want homes, starter homes, single family homes. And yet in the US, we are near the highest levels in our history of multifamily housing construction, apartment buildings. I think that that speaks to the need to think about why we're not building the types of things that people want. Why are builders not building it? What are the constraints on that? I think there are regulatory things. I think there are elements of kind of psychology of investment capital in housing and what's going on there. I think there's a lot of different stuff in play, but I think that we should be looking at supply constraints as a key place where we can make a difference on housing for families.
Fascinating stats there on the income by age and housing costs. But the discussion about the causes of all this are going to continue. But in the time we have left, I want to start turning toward some of the solutions, particularly those targeted at those starter homes, single family homes, the homes that in every single poll I've ever seen, a vast majority of people in general, but especially people with families kind of want, but aren't being built. Um, Lyman, I guess I'll start with you since you teed this up. What are some of the policy areas, whether federal, state, some other level, that you might look to help move the needle in a positive direction here?
Yeah, so I mean, there's the old axiom that when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. So I mean, I think the first thing is we need to think about subsidizing. We need to think about why and to what extent we are subsidizing demand. So you can think about housing assistance programs, right? Like federal tenant-based assistance. This is a fairly large amount of money that goes out, and the more expensive your county is, the more money the federal government will give you for housing to support housing. And on its face, that makes sense. We want to make sure that people can get housing where they live. Um, but what we're actually saying is we don't want to help the most people possible, right? Because if you wanted to house the most people possible, you would spend federal tenant-based assistance on the cheapest areas, right? You'd say, look, we're going to house all of the homeless people or housing precarious people of Dubuque before we house a single person in San Francisco, because a person in Dubuque is like 70% cheaper, right? And yet that's not what we do. Instead, we house the most expensive people first. I think that's a policy mistake. We do the same thing with community development block grants, where we give them disproportionately to expensive places because they show up as more housing precarious. So what we're doing is we are subsidizing demand. And we should not do that. We should, in fact, have these programs disproportionately go to housing and investment in places that are more affordable, which tend to be places that are more land abundant, which tend to be places with single family homes and starter homes and things like that. Beyond that, at the regulatory level, most of the regulations that we think about are state and local things, not federal. Um, I do think that there are opportunities to unlock additional housing supply through changes in regulation. I'm skeptical of some of the YIMBY type stuff. A lot of it just seems to be about getting a slightly taller apartment building that I don't think is really meeting people where they want to be. So I think tackling minimum lot size is really valuable. You can get a lot of density, you can get a lot of cost savings just by having the exact same house on a slightly smaller lot or on a much smaller lot. And people are willing to make that trade-off. We did a survey at IFS just recently where we forced people to basically make trade-offs in like a forced choice experiment, and people pretty consistently were willing to trade off lot size to get bedrooms, basically a bigger house. So allowing a bigger house on a smaller lot, so smaller lot size and a higher floor area ratio, um, is a good way to get more starter homes. And if you go and look at these post-war neighborhoods that are actually quite desirable places to live, that's what they are. They actually have relatively high floor area ratios in many cases. They actually have relatively small lot sizes. And so I think we should just build more of those. We should just build the neighborhoods that everybody wants to live in anyway. Like if you have like a kid draw a picture of like a neighborhood, they will draw floor area ratios and lot sizes that are illegal to build in most of America. They'll just naturally draw the houses closer together because that's how people instinctively think of a neighborhood.
Brian.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of Lyman's proposals, and would just sort of add to that. There should probably be some reconsideration of sort of these senior property tax exemptions that nearly every state has in some form or another. They effectively subsidize the ability of people age 60 over, 65 and older to stay in the same house. And there, even in some states like California, if you downsize, you can still take that sort of property tax abatement with you to the new place. Whereas normally what you would have to sort of rebase what you're paying with the new house. And so this just really sort of incentivizes people to stay in place, to not turn over their houses, or when they downsize, sort of be paying far less than they would into sort of the tax base, and therefore may come to cause some sort of unrest in public goods. But regardless, you do see this big increase in retiring in place, and it would be very surprising if all these different property tax programs didn't play some role in sort of constraining the natural turnover of housing that you would sort of see intergeneration. So I think that it's time for some reconsideration of that. The other thing that I would sort of add, which I alluded to earlier with sort of this aging of the housing stock, is that, there is sort of a closing of the suburban frontier to some extent. If you look at a map of most major cities, right, like we built the inner ring suburbs, we built like the next round of exurbs, and now in some place you're going to go even further out, but like the demand for a commute of like an hour or more, even this age of working from home, is not very high. And when you're thinking of your average 25-year-old with like a baby at home, they are not going to want to spend an hour in the car just to get that desirable house. So you do have this big pool of sort of like post-war housing, or sort of like this big building boom in the last 1920s. A lot of those houses are just fine for young families. They just need some work to be made, maybe to be rehabbed if they've sort of fallen into bad neighborhoods. Land banks have really done a lot in places like Detroit and other cities to sort of revitalize the local housing stock, or to get rid of unsightly demolitions to try to revive neighborhoods. There could be more of a federal effort to think about that, about what we can do with our existing housing stock to make it sort of more feasible for young families to buy these homes. And then the last thing I would say, and this is going to be somewhat controversial for those of us who lived through the great financial crisis, is that the tightening of lending standards that happened in the wake of the great financial crisis disproportionately made it harder for the youngest homeowners to buy a home, or the youngest people to buy a home. Like young people, unsurprisingly, sort of tend to have lower credit scores, short credit history. And one theory I've heard for why there's been this big run-up of rents that's been far stronger than the run-up in housing prices themselves is just, people in their 20s, not all of them, but a pool of them used to be able to buy a house, or the early 30s used to be able to buy a house. And now with these tightened lending standards, that's just much harder. And so you have to rent for longer to build up your credit history. And so that just like lengthens that life cycle model you have to sort of be part of in order to get those deep capital pools for you to buy a home. So those are sort of both some of the local and even federal measures that I would consider to sort of ease the problem.
Philip, Hungary is frequently in the news for its family policies, fairly generous family subsidies. I don't know if there's anything specific that related to housing in the Hungarian policy toolkit. I don't want to turn this into a whole discussion on Hungary, but yeah, any kind of thoughts from the international perspective on policy remedies here?
Well, I guess the policy remedy is different if you think that the problem is different, right? So if Brian and Lyman are right, increasing supply is the solution. Although I really do think getting 50% building to get rent prices down by 5% is just like an enormous ask. I just don't even know you conceivably do that just for 5%, you need to get them down, what, 25%? So we need to get it up, I don't know, 200% or something, 250. So I think like that's the solution if it's a supply constraint problem. If it's not a supply constraint problem, we only really have a couple of options here. And in fact, I'm almost inclined to not say what we should do, but probably what will happen. I think Brian alluded to it there. There's going to be a huge push for lower living standards. And we're going to get back mortgage-backed securities and we're going to get back Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. But rather than having the lending to low-income neighborhoods sticker on the front, we're going to have a family policy sticker on the front. That's pretty clearly the direction of travel here. And all the discussions around this stuff, the fact that some sort of quasi grassroots movement for building has sprung up, I'm just like, it's 2006 again. It just feels like that again. And I'm really worried we're moving there. And I'm really worried that if that happens, plays out like I say, it'll discredit family policy. I mean, what should they do if I'm correct? There's two options. In Europe, I'd say build council houses, but for families. Just build massively subsidized houses that you have to qualify for by like being, I don't know, 6 months pregnant or on your second child, or use your imagination. I wrote some stuff for it here in Hungary, offered it to the government. It's too close to the election to get it done. I had a family lottery system and stuff we could go through. I'm not going to go through it. Everyone can use their imagination, but effectively you massively subsidize. And when I say massively subsidize, I mean 30 to 50% off the price. So that's one option. You do what we did for poverty in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, but you target it at families. It's probably not a very good American solution, though, because the American system's quite different. The second option is enormous mortgage subsidies. You could probably do that through the Federal Reserve. You probably wouldn't even have to put it on balance sheet for the government. But if you don't do it properly, and it might even be inevitable, you might get the Fannie Mae Freddie Mac effect, and you might be back to ninja lens. But instead of no job, you have a job, and instead of no income, you have a large family or something like that. And we end up joking about it in 10 years from now, and we have a new acronym for it. But what's probably going to happen, here's my guess, either it's already a housing bubble that's developing and it crashes out with whatever we see a turn in the financial markets, and then we forget about it and we go back to talking about Keynesian demand management policy, or and here's my concern, because it might actually not be a bubble. It might be that we're at a point now where financial markets are just kind of to the moon. There's some evidence for that. And the fact that America is moving, in my opinion, in the direction of capital controls eventually, I think there's even more evidence for that. I think what's actually going to happen is there's going to be a political move to rent controls. And we're already seeing it in New York City. And I think that's where this is going. And I think it's long overdue. I'm not arguing for rent controls, but it's long overdue on the right to dust off the debates around rent controls, just to know what to expect. Because they didn't work in New York City. They did actually work in Vienna. If you go to Vienna and tell me it's not a functional city, sorry, it is. And it's got massive rent controls and they've been in place for a very long time. But it didn't work in the American context. And I think that's because the American political and economic system is quite different. But my concern is that none of the other policy, either we're going to have a bursting of a housing bubble again, or none of the other policies are going to work, and there's going to be massive political pressure, and that political pressure is going to cash out, as it is in New York right now, for rent controls.
Yeah, I'll just add here. I mean, I do think flipping the property tax advantage from seniors to people with families, well, it seems small because it's over a 30-year mortgage period, something like that. You could actually make a pretty big difference in the payments. And it's not going to solve every problem, but I think that could be significant. And to kind of connect the dots of what was said earlier, a lot of this stuff isn't so much a housing crisis as a transportation crisis. And if you could sort of move people faster and have them call it an optimized sprawl, people could probably spread out to the housing areas that they need, but still have a manageable commute. And it's been a source of perpetual fascination for me that this really isn't discussed much at all, or not much more. But we don't have too much time left. I don't know, Daniel, if there are any questions from the audience.
While we wait on questions, I'll just drop in and say, the property tax thing is interesting because there is not a single jurisdiction in the United States that gives a property tax exemption for children. Um, For old people, it's all over the place, but there are none for children. The reason is, of course, the property tax pays for schools. So why would you exempt the people who are driving the cost, right? But it's this interesting argument where um, we would never help families have a house because families are the problem. They're why we have to pay property taxes for the schools.
And that dynamic might change, right? Like as the number of children shrink, the number of seniors grow, then, what I'm seeing locally here where I live is an increase in discussions about, well, how can we provide housing for seniors, right? How can public dollars be used to provide housing for seniors? And so given that that seniors sort of have gone from the poorest segment of the adult population to now the wealthiest, it might be one of those things where the politics change. That's not my area of expertise, but
I hope so.
it's the
Well, I
future is
mean,
interesting in that sense.
that's a very, I mean, one, I don't want to get too generational here, but I think some might call it a very boomer mindset to think about extracting as much wealth as they can without taking care of the next generation and helping families. It seems a bit short-sighted to me, even if you're not directly paying for the schools. But leaving all that aside, we haven't actually discussed the overall school issue and family economics. Obviously, families want to live in places with good schools. Good schools tend to be those in areas with the most money. Um, there's a sort of cyclical dynamic there. Places with bad schools, families don't want to live there. That affects the housing values in both directions. Anyone have any thoughts on that issue? And what if anything, how we should think about it? What if anything should be done to connect the schools and the housing discussion?
I mean, I think this is where school choice is an interesting sort of strategic move because, in principle, although there's still obviously a nexus between location and schooling, even if you have full school choice, you can choose to live in a cheaper neighborhood a little bit farther from the school if you can still choose on where to send your kid, right? You can live in a cheaper area and then commute your kid over to school. Um, I think that providing families more opportunities for that kind of thing opens up more residential space. I think it's worth noting that every expensive city in the country has a cheap neighborhood. It's just often has really high crime. And I think schools, when we think about with housing, because we're used to the fact that there are school districts that are spatial. But the reality is, there are also, practically speaking, crime districts that are spatial. Another way to expand the map of places that are good for family life is to ferociously police and reduce crime in currently highly affordable neighborhoods. And yes, that'll cause their property values to go up, but it relieves pressure on other neighborhoods. If you simply had a bigger geography of short commute neighborhoods that are safe to live in, you'll have a lot more options of safe, healthy places to raise kids.
Education isn't sort of my area of expertise, but I think that there is one trend that you could sort of keep an eye on here that might help resolve some of this problem. Is that, with the sort of the shrinking number of children, a lot of school districts are going to have to consolidate, right? Like one other thing that these expensive places have in common versus the least expensive places is that they're sort of honeycombed with these like little school districts based on just one little town. Where if for example, in the Boston area, there's ferocious competition to live in, say, the best school district, Lexington, whatever. I haven't lived in Boston for a while, but like there's a couple of school districts that are really highly desirable. Whereas if you go into the South or into rural parts of America, you have county level school districts. And my understanding is that when you have a county level school district, there's just sort of a lot less of a location premium, right? Like it kind of just matters less like what part of the county you live in. Maybe you want to be part of the catchment area of a particular elementary school, or maybe for like if there's two high schools, something like this. But it's just not, you sort of have less intensive competition for a couple of desirable districts and then sort of like really cheap areas because schools aren't as good that you see instead of the broader Northeast. So, one trend that I'll be keeping an eye on is sort of consolidation and what that means for sort of local property taxes, whether that helps sort of reduce this sort of winner take all effect of a couple of good schools in some cities, followed by lots of mediocre or poor schools if they're just kind of the wrong side of a boundary.
I want to throw one other thing out there, and we got a couple of audience questions. I think particularly, the online right has identified immigration as a major issue, and I suspect they're exaggerating a little bit, but if we just get rid of the immigrants, they say, then all the housing price problems will be gone. Um, without going into that particular framing of it, but do you have views on how much immigration has been a factor, and what, if anything, you might expect to see if those immigration policies were reversed?
I mean, I can take a stab at it. We paused for a second. Who wanted to take the
I
plunge?
know.
I'll bite. I think that I mean I lived in Canada for a while these last few years, and it was very obvious that the very sudden surge in migration into Canada was causing serious housing constraints, particularly in the neighborhoods where uh, sort of immigrants were most clustered. Um, that is that you just get a lot of housing crowding and you get a lot of rising rents. Um, so it seems like certainly at the local level, and possibly even at large aggregations, a sudden surge in migration can definitely increase housing prices. So yes, there like these sudden explosions in migration from waves of refugees definitely matter. That said, in the long run, we have a lot of evidence that suggests that uh, migrants, particularly kind of low and moderate skilled migrants, in the long run are relatively neutral on housing prices because, yes, they increase demand, but they first of all increase demand at a quote unquote discounted price point, which means they don't tend to be driving like a huge run up in like price increases through quality improvements. And secondly, they disproportionately work on the supply side of this question, right? Like what share of the guys who are building your house are Hispanic? Like a lot. It's a lot. And so fundamentally, there's actually a paper that looks at like exogenous shocks to deportations and migration and finds that reducing the number of recent immigrants has like a small effect, possibly a positive effect on house prices. That is, reducing the number of illegal immigrants maybe increases house prices slightly in the long run. It's a small effect. It's probably not worth reading too much into, but the point is, sudden huge shocks can definitely dislocate housing markets. In the long run, having more workers who specialize in construction is also good for housing supply, which is reasonably good for prices.
Speaking of Canada, I believe it was Vancouver that started charging an extra tax on sort of absentee landlords, maybe it's foreign investors owning
Did they?
homes.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. I don't, have any of those policies worked, had any effect? Maybe you haven't studied. I'm throwing
I
this
don't
out
know.
at you from nowhere, but yeah. All right, a couple more questions from the audience for you. I have one here on, do you see forming multi-generational housing as one potential solution to this crisis? Why or why not? If so, what supports could be put in place to help these sorts of households? And I open it up to anybody who wants to jump in first.
I would just say that like I don't think the demand for intergenerational housing is that high. I think people seem to like it in theory quite a bit, but like in practice, what you sort of see is revealed preference. When people have a chance to have their own detached single family home, that's what they gravitate to. And, you generally see increases in children living with parents in times of economic distress, not when sort of there are options to do otherwise.
We're actually living through a huge increase in multi-generational housing. Like it's at like some of the highest levels we've seen in a long time. And it sucks. People don't like it. No one wants to live with their in-laws. Um, and also when people live with a parent, it's one of the strongest negative variables on fertility that we know of. Living with your parent is just terrible for baby making for many reasons. Um, so I personally, I would like to see as little multi-generational housing as possible.
All right, one
Having
more
having
question.
grandma 2 minutes down the road is great. I'll say that's great. Love it. Access is wonderful. Co-residence is not.
Yeah, I mean that's I mean there's cultural factors in here. There's, kind of historic norms in here. Kind of an interesting question. I think, 200 years ago, um, I'm not sure people would have said, maybe they would. I haven't studied it, but once you go down this path, you can't really go back. Um, Another question from the audience: are environmental restrictions on land development a big deal or not really? In my mind, that is why housing is cheaper in red states, or cheaper in red states than in blue states. Any thoughts?
I mean, a bunch of studies have sort of dug into this, particularly in the case of California, where the regulatory burden is in many ways the highest, particularly the environmental regulatory burden is the highest. There are a lot of fingers being pointed at it. I think there's something to it. Would I necessarily trust the numbers out of any one study on sort of how much it inflates housing values? No. But I think that you should ascribe a relatively high importance to their impact on sort of the general equilibrium price.
Yeah, I would reaffirm that like urban growth boundaries, like one of the best predictors of where a city will fall in terms of the price of its housing compared to the level of local income. So that's kind of like affordability measure is just does it have an urban growth boundary? If it has an urban growth boundary, that is essentially a green belt rule. It's going to fall way higher up the list of like more expensive metros. You can debate if that's an environmental rule, or if it's an aesthetic rule or what. But at the end of the day, um, uh, arbitrary land uh, separation, segmenting land off from development. Yeah, of course. If you restrict the supply of land, there's less land for building on. It's not rocket science.
Philip, I'll give you the last word, and maybe I'll come back to my Vancouver question, particularly if you see kind of the financialization of housing as the major problem here. Would you support things like what Vancouver tried to do, or other restrictions on absentee landlords, speculative purchases of properties by institutional investors or others? Do you think any of that would move the needle?
I thought about it a lot. In terms of the speculative landlord, the absentee landlords, I just think it's really hard. You're going to move into capital controls territory. I mean, if you want to whack capital controls on your economy, you can. We might be moving there. We'll see with these tariffs. But if you don't want to do that arbitrarily, that's a big step. Let's just say that's a big step. In terms of doing it domestically, I think the rich guy's always going to have a better lawyer than the government. I just really think so. Like, Julius, you used to work in finance. Like, come on, like you just hire a big, good law firm from New York City, and they'll figure you a loophole around to get, carve it out, set up an ownership structure, et cetera, et cetera. So I just don't think you're going to outregulate hungry capital if it is speculative capital. I just don't think you're going to outregulate it. And that's why I say you have to do really immediate interventions here. You have to do something like massively subsidized housing. Or again, if I'm correct, look, I might be wrong. Maybe it's a supply and demand problem. Maybe it's all going to go away when we build more houses. I don't think it is, but maybe it is. Or you do what is actually going to be put on the menu, in my opinion, which is rent controls. But no, I don't think you're going to outmaneuver the finance guys. I just say one thing when you're talking about like I think I want to be a bit meta on some of the questions that were asked. Like we're living in a moment right now where absolutely everything is read through the lens of housing prices, whether it's like political polarization, intergenerational dynamics, immigration, et cetera, et cetera. We're reading everything through this lens. Why are we so fixated on house prices? I know they're a problem. I get it, but it just makes me feel it feels bubbly to me. The whole thing feels like a from being a finance person, the whole thing feels a bit bubbly to me. When the taxi driver starts talking about a stock, you sell it. You know what I mean?
I like to leave these discussions on a cliffhanger, so that's perfect. We are out of time. So thank you very much to this panel. I think a lot of food for thought in there. Hopefully, we can continue these conversations soon. But I'm going to turn it over to Leah Labresco Sargent and the next panel on the politics of housing. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We're happy to be here for the second part of this family policy and housing panel. I'm going to have each of my panelists introduce themselves in just one moment. I'm your moderator, Leah Sargent. I work on family policy for the Niskanen Center, specifically on family economic security. And I'd like to start with, well, thank you so much. We're happy to be here for the second part of this. So I'd like each panelist to, you can all hear exactly how large my single family house is because my baby is being carried to a less noisy part of it elsewhere. I'd like to have each of my co-panelists start out by digging into one question together and just giving one sentence of introduction for yourself. When we look at the stats of housing, we know that the median age of first-time home buyers hit 38 last year, up from 35 the year before. And back in the 80s, that number for typical first-time home buyer was 29. So the disruptions to housing and the housing market, don't just matter in terms of exactly how much space do they have and where they have, but how families think about their progression towards a good life. When are they ready to get married? When are they ready to have children? And I'd like to start by asking each of you, what do you think is the most pressing problem in the housing market for families in particular? Michael, why don't we start with you? Just a sense of introduction and what's the most pressing problem?
Well, thank you. I'm Michael Lind. I'm a fellow at New America and a columnist at Tablet. I think there are two distinct problems involved in housing and family policy. One involves multi-generational housing, the number of 25 to 34-year-olds who live with parents or grandparents or other relatives has tripled since the 1970s. It's now 1 in 4 Americans. And many elderly people live with their middle-aged children. In some cases, there are zoning restrictions or restrictive covenants which prevent so-called granny flats, annexes, multi-generational housing. And I think that is a serious concern nationwide because of the aging of the population in particular. The other issue, which gets more attention than multi-generational housing, has to do with access to housing and single-family homes. And there, I think the national statistics are misleading because outside of a few very desirable superstar cities, there's lots of affordable housing in the US. It's just not in places where young professionals in particular want to go, like San Francisco and New York. But if you want to go to small town or suburban Texas, where I live, there's ample affordable housing.
Thank you so much. Let's go to Daniel Kishi next. Make sure you're unmuted.
Apologies. Can you hear me? Great. My name is Daniel Kishi, policy advisor at American Compass. And I think I would, broadly make two observations. First is, American Compass has done some survey research sort of polling American families on sort of where they want to live, views, values that America sort of advances, and those, or what the ideal sort of value should be. All of our polling always suggests that there is sort of a strong preference towards rootedness rather than mobility. To sort of Michael's point, the opportunity, or rather the ability to have a good job near your hometown where you can raise your family on an affordable basis is the preference of the vast majority of Americans. I would also say that many American families view owning a home as sort of a critical ingredient of middle class life. We've also done polling in relation to our cost of thriving index, a product that we published to sort of get a sense as to the inflationary impact for key components of middle class life. And it demonstrates that 3/4 of respondents view ownership of a home as sort of a key ingredient. And then, again, to Michael's point, data consistently shows a strong preference to the type of home they own. Single family home is the desired form of housing. And so I think that agree with Michael in some sense of sort of the broader housing discourse dominated by urban professionals often diagnoses problems and proposes sort of solutions that they may not be what most American families might want.
And Richard, let's go to you next.
Great. Thanks, Leah. Great to be with everyone. My name's Richard Collenberg. I'm Director of Housing, also Director of the American Identity Project at the Progressive Policy Institute. And I'm author of a recent book called Excluded, How Snob Zoning, NIMBYism, and Class Bias Build the Walls We Don't See, which is conveniently located right behind me for those who could see it. So I see twin problems. The first is affordability for families, and the second is rising class segregation of neighborhoods, which keeps working class families, even middle class families, out of high opportunity school districts. So I think both of those issues are important. I always enjoy being with my friend Mike Lind, and always find what he says interesting. I'm going to disagree a little bit, though, I think, on the extent of the problem. I don't think it's concentrated in a few superstar cities anymore. I'm part of a group called Up for Growth that documented underproduction of housing in 48 states. There's not a county in the entire country where you can make minimum wage and easily afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And I know we'll get to politics later, but I think that's why we're seeing, housing and land use reform, not just in places like California or Massachusetts, but also in Utah and Wyoming and Vermont and other states that might not have been seen as at the epicenter of the housing affordability crisis, but now are feeling the pressure to do something about housing prices. So I'll be the pessimist on the panel and say that I think the problem is bigger than just in for professionals in a small number of cities.
Yeah, and I appreciate you guys bracketing it into those kind of two regions, the urban cores, and I'll say everywhere else, though, of course, there's a pretty broad range of that because we're looking at different kinds of solutions. So let's start with the urban core for one round, and then we'll go everywhere else. It seems like even if you feel that urbanist YIMBYs are overrepresented in housing discourse, they're identifying a real demand for housing that the market is struggling to satisfy. I'm curious Do you guys agree with that characterization that if it were legal to build more, including near transit, people, including families, might flock to those areas? Do you think the GIMBYs are misjudging the latent demand and that building won't fundamentally help those cities, or something else? Richard, why don't we start with you there?
Well, I think the fact that housing prices are so high suggests that there is a lot of demand, and we're not meeting it with supply. So I think I think the remedy is to reduce exclusionary zoning in areas that make it illegal to build anything other than a single family home. Oftentimes, throwing in a minimum lot size on top of that. I propose something called an Economic Fair Housing Act, because I think the issue of fair housing goes beyond race today and goes to class. And that would allow a plaintiff to sue a community that was engaged in class-based discrimination. So I'm not talking about the housing market. Obviously, the market by definition discriminates based on class. Some houses are more expensive than others. But I think when entire jurisdictions say you're welcome to live here, but we, so long as you can afford, a single family detached home on a quarter acre lot, that's rank class discrimination. So I think that's an important element in the solution. And I'll just say one more word about this. The Economic Fair Housing Act would work like the Fair Housing Act, put the burden on the community, the municipality to justify, give a really good reason for why they have their policies in place. And sometimes they would have a good reason, but oftentimes not. And so that would put pressure on communities to become less exclusive.
Now, Richard, let me ask you one follow-up there about the different political considerations here, and then I'll go to your fellow panelists. I appreciate you kind of just making that distinction between race and class-mediated conflict, but I haven't heard you talk that much about age, and I'm wondering how you see that playing. And in the previous hour, for anyone joining us now, there was some discussion about houses more and more being a savings vehicles, which to my mind promotes a age-based cleavage where people currently in housing are very motivated for high prices of housing. People, younger, even on the same class or career trajectory, are more interested in lower affordable housing. But you have this strong division between these age-based interests. How do you think about that? And could that ever be reflected in law?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in large measure, the age cleavage is a class cleavage, that it's wealthier, older people who've accumulated savings over time, and younger struggling families. It doesn't divide precisely in those directions, but I think broadly speaking, there's a class dynamic there. And sometimes communities are even more explicit. They will say, we will welcome small apartments in this community, but heaven forbid we have 2 or 3 or 4 bedrooms, because that would mean families. That would mean students in schools, and older people, wealthier people would have to pay for that. So that is another form of discrimination that we see in our housing policies.
Now, Daniel and Michael, I wanted to ask you to just weigh in. We're going to start on the urban core and move our way out through the sprawl. Do you think there is latent unmet demand? And does the government have any role to play in helping people who wish to move to cities succeed at doing so?
Well,
Michael,
in my
I'm
opinion,
a skeptic here, so go on.
in my opinion, you have to distinguish by class. I don't think the federal government has any role in having people who aspire to be actors in Hollywood, or have college degrees and want to be financiers in Wall Street, and they can't get jobs that pay them enough in Manhattan so they can live in Midtown Manhattan. That's tough luck. I mean, these are desirable cities and desirable jobs, and there has always been a surplus of talent going back to Paris in the 19th century. Art, you had starving artists and garrets because there were more artists than there were art collectors. All right. So it's a personal tragedy but it's not a national issue. Now, when it comes to Richard raised the question of people on the minimum wage not being able to afford houses. Well, if that's the case, then raise the minimum wage, right? Raise wages. My concern with this proposal is the same as with the so-called poor doors in New York apartment buildings where the poor people live in the basement and then the people whose homes they clean live above them. That this is essentially the government would be socializing the cost of the servants of the middle class and the rich. So if you want your Uber drivers and your nannies and your maids and your gardeners to be able to live in the same city as you, then just pay them enough so they can do so. I don't see why it's an issue for the American public in general.
Let me ask you one follow-up there, and then I'll go to Dan for his response. It seems like you have this issue of you have a class of workers who can't afford to live in a city, but the city very much wants there to be janitors, teachers,
But it doesn't want to pay their
cleaners.
wages.
Well, that's my question. You have a couple options. You can be trying to raise wages above what would be, prevailing wages in those industries elsewhere. You could legalize SROs, so there's extremely low cost housing. How do you think about the trade-off between those different levers?
Well, in my most recent book, Hell to Pay, which was about wages and unionization, I argued that we have now created a low wage, high welfare state where we enable businesses and the affluent to pay people poverty wages that they cannot live on. And then the taxpayer tops up their income with cash transfers like the EITC, with in-kind benefits like Section 8 housing and SNAP. So if you add this housing benefit, that's just building a new wing onto the what I see as the malign structure of the low wage, high welfare state. It's better to have a high wage, low welfare, low subsidy state.
And let me just check, are you putting in the same bucket of kind of federal subsidy for housing, something like a Section 8 voucher to pay your prevailing market rent, and something like legalizing SROs to just make it legal to build cheaper housing? Or do those both count as federal subsidy that's going against
I think that anybody who works 40 hours a week should be able to afford a lower middle class lifestyle in a community. And if they can't do that without government help, then they should move to another community. Or if their employers want them to stay, their employers should pay, not the taxpayers.
All right. Daniel, over to you for our urban core round. Do you think there is latent unmet demand for housing in the urban core? And what, if anything, should the state do to help developers meet that demand?
Yeah, it seems pretty obvious that there is a mismatch in supply and demand. I live here in Washington. Rents are far higher than I would like to pay. There are obvious sort of limitations on housing supply in the core in the urban area itself. And of course, Washington's its own animal with the sort of high price suburbs and sort of the commute times associated with that. But I think if you look at, other, again, sort of these super cities, Zoran victory in New York, I think housing clearly was a driving force of his candidacy. I think the Manhattan Institute had put out some survey research saying that 30% of New York Democratic primary voters had housing listed as their number one issue over other sort of considerations, sort of inclusive of crime. So I think that absolutely, is certainly zoning regulations, land use regulations in the sort of major metro areas and in their surrounding neighborhoods, that are necessary to align sort of supply and demand. I guess to sort of maybe reiterate the other point I think that we've made previously, I would just sort of be reluctant to sort of affirm this as the necessary course of things in the sense of these major cities, tier one, tier two cities being, the only places where a young person can sort of feel as if he or she can achieve sort of a middle class life. So maybe sort of a geographical distribution of economic opportunity. And then, insofar as there are legitimate problems in an urban setting, major metro area, reiterating the, remedies that are appropriate there are not necessarily the remedies that are appropriate in the vast majority of places that Americans live or might want to live.
All right, now I have a broad scale families and housings and small towns question for all of you. In Tim Carney's Family Unfriendly, he talked to, I think, a mayor or a city council person who said families are basically bad for his town. Families consume a lot of services. They consume schooling, they consume parks. They make a lot of use of things that cost the town to provide, and they do relatively less spending their disposable income, paying sales tax, and then double income, no kids households. To what extent do you think cities and towns prioritize having families as part of their mix? And to what extent are they right in the short term that families cost a town when you increase the percentage of families more than they're providing? This time, let's start with you, Daniel. Are mayors essentially right? Families are a nuisance, but one they all have to bear? Or, are they justified a little bit in wishing the families would all move one town over where they don't affect their own property taxes?
Sure. Never having been responsible for sort of a city budget, I can't speak too much of it. I mean, I think that as with a lot of sort of public policy making, strikes me as highly short-sighted as a sort of, meeting short-term sort of fiscal goals rather than understanding that what is obvious the case, which is that investments in family, having environments that are conducive to families, sort of set a sort of base for long-term economic prosperity, political prosperity for American families, as well as the communities that they sort of exist in.
Richard or Michael, what would you say to the mayor who says, look, families are kind of a drain on our budget compared to double income, no kids?
I'll jump in. I think Tim Carney is saying the quiet part out loud. That is what a lot of jurisdictions think. If they said it publicly, if an elected official said that, it would be disastrous. But there is this sense that NIMBYs will say, our schools are just too crowded. That we can't possibly accommodate more people. And it makes so little sense to me when neighborhoods turn over naturally, old people die or they their kids grow up. When people move on, we don't say, this new family can't move in because they've got kids. I mean, that's something that would happen in a totalitarian society. We don't say that. So I think it is part of the logic of NIMBYism, but it's appalling when we actually hear it said explicitly. If I can just also return quickly to a couple of points Michael made. I completely agree that we want to raise wages for workers. And I wrote a book called Labor Organizing as a Civil Right, which was precisely intended to increase the bargaining power of workers. I think that's important. But to be clear, the Economic Fair Housing Act I'm proposing is I think to your point, Leah, is not it's not an expansion of a federal subsidy. It's not. I'm not saying I wouldn't mind increasing Section 8 vouchers, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying let's legalize alternative forms of housing where it is currently illegal to build anything but a single family home, and that would have a positive effect. The last thing I'll say is that I think Daniel made this point that what's wrong with people just staying where they are in low cost areas. I think again, it's deeply un-American. There's, the great migration of Black people was in part to flee Jim Crow, but it was in partly to go to where the good jobs are. When the Okies left Oklahoma to California, that was part of a migration that helped make us a better country and a more productive one. I mean, the costs that economists have associated with the fact that people can't move to opportunity, instead have to move to affordability for housing. The costs are tremendous to our society. So I'd like to see the people get housing where they want it.
Michael, I'd love to hear what you say to the mayor who says, kids not great for my budget, families less useful to me than just pure consumers. And I'd also love to hear you respond to Richard's point right there about people wanting to move for opportunity and finding that more outside of their home. So just one then the other, because I appreciated the crosstalk between you two.
Yeah, well, all mayors and economic development agency officials would love it if they could deport all of the lower income people and bring in rich capitalists who live off of their trust funds and investments and new factories, and well-paid professionals who will spend lots of money. A decade or two ago, as you may recall, there was a lot of talk about the creative class, the way that all these small towns in the Midwest would revitalize, they would have fern bars, right? And exotic restaurants, and this would attract the creative. So that's just naked class snobbery, right? It's saying like we're going to attract ambitious college educated professionals and they will gentrify our town and get rid of these people who are already here. So I think all three of us agree about that. I think there is a structural solution to this problem with mayors and economic development agencies, and I've written about this before. That is to bring back general revenue sharing, which was a program we had between Nixon and Reagan. And a lot of countries raise taxes at the national level and then distribute them on a per person basis across the country. And we did that for a while. And it was abolished in the Reagan tax reforms of the 1980s. But if that's the case, then you don't have to raise all of the money for your schools and your roads and your fire and police departments from your low-income community. You can have world-class infrastructure in schools and so on, and a lot of it's being paid for partly by these rich people in these coastal superstar cities through the federal government. So on the other issue, Richard and I agree about the importance of wages and collective bargaining. Where I think we disagree is this moving to opportunity. My grandfather was a janitor. Janitors do not read the janitor trade papers and say, well, if I move to Akron, Ohio, I can have a better salary as a janitor. And if you move from Akron to San Francisco, you're going to be worse off as a janitor because your dollar goes further in Akron. On the other hand, most college educated professionals, and I'm one, I lived in New York and Washington, D.C. for most of my life. You can only pursue your career if you're ambitious in one or two specialized cities. It's New York for finance. It's the Bay Area, and maybe a few other places for tech. It's Los Angeles, if you want to be an actor or producer, director. And so I just think we need to keep these things separate. Most Americans, according to the New York Times 10 years ago, live within 18 miles of their mother. They did American women because women live longer. And whenever I'm in a group of professionals, I ask people to raise their hand. Do you live within 18 miles of your mother? And nobody raises their hands. And the reason is because most working class people can do their jobs in every county in the United States. If the most common jobs are retail clerk, home health aide, construction worker, things like that, you don't need to move across the country to opportunity, right? And if you lose your construction job, you can become a security guard.
Well, let me linger on that point about living near your mother on behalf of all the mothers of panelists, attendees, people asking questions who ask, why won't you move home? I'd like to ask all our panelists to think a little about what's required for a community to be somewhere where kids can move back to or stay even. So, we've talked a little bit about the preference for single family homes, about, the different sizes or lot sizes, especially in the prior panel, that might make single family homes more expensive over time. It seems like for a number of young people today, we see that first time home buyer age going up. They're not able to live easily as close to their mother as they might want. They might need to chase affordability somewhere else. They might find that their mother's house is out of scope for them at the same age it was when their mother and father bought it. So if you want to build a local community that kind of can accommodate young families getting ready to have kids, older retirees, much older retirees who need skilled nursing care, young high school or college graduates who aren't married yet but are looking, you need a broader range of housing in close proximity than just single family houses to meet all those different kinds of people's needs. Do those, new graduates of high school and college need apartments to be able to be close enough to their mother to meet someone locally who wants to live in family housing when they're ready? Daniel, I'll start with you. Daniel, you're having a little trouble with your Zoom? I'll start with you, Richard. Does single family housing allow for a wide variety of life cycle points to all live in close proximity to each other?
I think the answer is in a lot of certainly in desirable communities, no. So there may be some areas of the country where that's possible, but in order to allow people to live, people of all different ages to live within a particular jurisdiction, you're going to have to allow for different types of housing, and the key word here is allow. We're not talking about the government stepping in and providing this housing necessarily. We're talking about the government stepping back and permitting developers to meet the demand that's there. And so I think it's enormously important. One of the I know we're supposed to talk about politics too, and one of the big issues that I heard from Scott Wiener in California, big advocate of more housing and change, is that the one argument that worked with NIMBYs was their kids, their adult kids could not afford to live in the same community, could never, it was inconceivable that they'd be able to afford these a single family home. And that's why allowing more types of housing, allowing developers to meet the demand, letting the market work rather than constraining it is vitally important in my view.
Michael, over to you. If you want to have a community where people can live throughout their life cycle, do you need more than single family homes, or are young people like comets where they'll need to go somewhere else and come back later in life?
Well, realistically, I think we're talking about different structures. One is having duplexes and apartment complexes interspersed among single family homes or even high-rise apartments. The other is having what Lennar Homes and LENAR and others are now building in subdivisions. These are multi-gen housing, multi-generation homes. They're basically single family, multi-generational homes where you have one family, but it's three generations under one roof, and you can have the widowed grandmother and the college kid and so on. But what you don't get, and there may be restrictive covenants against this, they can't use this as an Airbnb, right? And they're not renting it out, which is what the neighbors are worried about, that it will become a transient hotel. Now, in terms of politics, I think I can easily see a lot of support nationwide in every county, in every city, for making multi-generational housing easier as we have an aging population. But what I don't see is, as long as we have private market in land and housing and federalism. I don't see a jurisdiction that imposes multi-class zoning in one area. They're going to lose the middle and the upper class because they're snobs. I mean, on this, Richard and I agree. And there will be a tipping point, just as there was with racism, where, so unless this is everywhere simultaneously in the country, then when you get enough working class people move in next door, the upper middle class and rich people are going to go somewhere else.
And now I want to turn, I want to turn to Daniel, whose Zoom is working again. Daniel, the question was, in order to have the kind of hometown that you can return to, where you can raise your kids down the street from your parents, does that require something different than single family housing for full life cycle housing in a community?
Yeah, I think I make sense more from my perspective to liberalize on the margins, to sort of have single family zoning maybe be the base by which you are able to sort of introduce additional units, accessory dwelling units as of right, where you can sort of build additional add-ons to house a aging mother or father, for them to live where you live, to move maybe out of their house to allow for there to be churn sort of in the market. I think sort of reforms like that make good sense to me. I think, again, a bit different than sort of the densification of the suburbs, where, hearing some folks in the YIMBY community, again, perhaps uncharitable or maybe not representative of everybody who wants sort of more housing supply. But the idea that, we want sort of mixed use zoning, large multifamily housing complex, the abolition of single family housing. I think that there is not a political constituency, nor does that reflect what Americans want, nor is it, I think, responsible in responding to the legitimate sort of preferences of living near, either your college kids or your older parents.
And now I do invite folks who are watching with us live to share your questions in the chat. I see two questions about the consolidation in cities that I will consolidate into one question. So pulling both from Bronwyn and Tyler's questions in the chat, I'm seeing more skepticism that the returns to moving to a big city are worth it for a broader class of people than just motivated, upwardly mobile urban professionals. Tyler asked, don't, some cities get all the best jobs. The workload isn't spread as easily. It's easier to work for a big, prosperous company than a small local company. Easier to demand a higher wage at that point, even if the city is larger. And that, even just the matter of marriage, Bronwyn says, means that you may create couples where one of them needs to be in the city, even if the other one could have happily been somewhere else. So, how do the panels respond to this question of increasing returns to scale, such that those who stay out of the biggest, fastest growing cities are missing out not just on potentially moving up the employment ladder, but also, amenities, mating markets, anything else? Michael, let's start with you.
Well, I think if that were the case, we would see more domestic net migration from less dense areas to high dense areas. In fact, and that's what we see in the case of professionals. So what we've seen is we've had these real estate bubbles in these superstar cities, is the working class people tend to leave. They just move and they go presumably to similar jobs in cheaper areas in other cities or in other states. And they seem to give up the, dating market, to have, their dollar go further from their pay. What we see is a certain inflexibility with regard to professionals. And again, I don't want to just keep harping on this, but I think this is central to it. If you want to be an actor, you're going to go to LA. It doesn't matter how expensive it is, right? Because otherwise you have to give up your dreams. If you want to be in finance, you go to New York and you just find some way to do it. You may lobby for YIMBYism, but you want to be in New York because otherwise you can't be a global financier in Tulsa, Oklahoma. whereas you can do most working class jobs in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I kind of push back against this moving to opportunity stuff. And there was an absurd paper done about a decade ago, like the average American would increase his or her productivity by so much if you move from like rural Mississippi to San Francisco. That's only true if you're a venture capitalist or if you're a computer program. It's not true if you're a health clerk, a health aide, or a retail clerk, or a construction worker or builder or mover.
Now, I will ask one follow-up there because I certainly see the push for people in narrow industries. Every AI researcher wants to be in San Francisco. But it seems like school teacher is one of the jobs you can do anywhere, with varying ability to command a wage versus what your costs are. But a school teacher who lives in New York City has a lot of amenities available to them that a school teacher, who lives in rural Georgia does not. Are some of these kind of compounding, now there's every kind of cuisine I want. Now the free Shakespeare in the Park has professional actors and it's just as free. Are these relevant to lower income or working class people, or are they not relevant to their questions about where to move and where to settle?
Well, I think when it comes to parks and public services and so on, as I said, I think we should equalize that through nationalizing funding and through revenue sharing. But on the other hand, let's face it, Birmingham, England is never going to be London, right? Glasgow, Scotland is not going to be London either. And to say that, well, should more people evacuate the rest of the United Kingdom and go into London, which is this already overcrowded metropolis? I don't think so. I think we should decentralize funding for good basic public amenities so that even in a low-income community, you have world-class amenities. But I'm with Daniel. I would rather see the decentralization of industry and high-paying jobs instead of just taking it for granted that unless you're in one of half a dozen big superstar cities, you just can't have a good quality of life.
Daniel, what levers are attractive to you to decentralize high-paying jobs in the United States? Make sure you unmute.
Apologies. It's amusing that you had a slip of tongue and said deindustrialize, because I do think that is clearly a structural factor when sort of paired with a college for all model of our higher education system that has resulted in combination with the fact that if you're sort of an upwardly mobile professional, career aspiring, want a sort of middle class quality of life, that it does sort of necessitate you living towards, or rather moving towards, these tier one, tier two sort of cities. I think that there's, obvious instances where sort of agglomeration occurs. New York City will always be sort of a finance hub. Hollywood will always be sort of where you go to sort of make movies. It obviously does not make a lot of sense if you aspire to those things to not, take a shot and move to the big city and try your luck. But I think that, an indirect lever that sort of could be kind of a contributing to sort of a broader distribution of economic opportunity is sort of the efforts from this administration, the previous, and then the first term of President Trump's presidency to reindustrialize the country, to sort of bring trade and industrial policies to bear. That again, there will be potential agglomeration effects. The Detroits and the Pittsburghs, always North Carolina for furniture making. There was always sort of had that effect, but I think that manufacturing broadly distributed across the country near points of logistics, etc., as well as sort of the recognition, the realization that a college for all model is no longer appropriate or maybe even desirable for the high schoolers and the college age folks now, potentially could reverse the trends, or how sort of acute some of these trends have been with regards to housing cost affordability in these major cities.
And Richard, I'm less sure of where you are on this. Would you like to see over the next 10 to 15 years more agglomeration in cities about the same level or more decentralization away from cities?
Well, I guess more decentralization. Honestly, I'm not at all an expert in how on earth one goes about doing that. I guess my main point would be, while we're waiting for that to happen, I'd like in a free society for more people who want to move to New York or San Francisco or wherever Los Angeles, if they want to move there, that it's not impossible because the government has prevented it. I keep coming back to the source of this problem, because if it were simply the free market at work and some places are more desirable than others and therefore more expensive and there's nothing you can do about it, that would be one thing. But we have all these policies in place to artificially drive up the price of housing in Los Angeles and San Francisco and New York. So I think that's point number one. The other point that I want to come back to is I think it was a point Daniel made. There was kind of this notion that doing something about single family exclusionary zoning was pie in the sky. It's just not going to happen. And 10 years ago, I would have agreed with that. NIMBY's always won. That's, I think, outdated. Once Minneapolis in 2018 said we're going to legalize duplexes and triplexes throughout the entire city, and then you saw the state of Oregon do the same thing, and the state of California do it, and then other states. It doesn't matter whether it's red or blue. I mean, Florida has the Live Local Act, where when there is a commercial area and they're setting aside a share of housing for workforce areas, you override the local zoning restrictions. So this has become, the pendulum has begun to swing on this issue, and we're starting to see progress. And therefore, I don't think we have to resort to a one-part strategy, which is build up communities that are not thriving now. Certainly, I'm not opposed to that. But I'd also like to see people move to opportunity, just as Black people did during the Great Migration.
This brings me to a last question from the comments from Benjamin, who asks, what's low-hanging, near-term achievable fruit, and how does it differ in red states versus blue states for housing policy? Daniel, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I'm not sure if any of this is low-hanging fruit necessarily. I mean, I think that when you are sort of thinking about an issue such as housing, there are going to be any number of friction points and impediments to, even on the margins, sort of increasing or relaxing sort of zoning laws. I do think, though, that there is, to sort of my preference of sort of allowing for the construction of new family homes, potentially maybe sort of, reducing a minimum lot size, allowing for ADUs, or sort of the ability to sort of construct additional rooms on your property that you own. That is like marginal in a sense, but I think that it is therefore probably potentially more politically achievable, even given sort of the sort of choke points that exist in sort of local and state politics.
Michael, what do you think's low-hanging, near-term fruit, and does it differ in red states versus blue?
Oh, I agree with Daniel. I think nationwide, making it easier to have accessory dwelling units and multi-generational housing for family members, not for paying renters. I think that would be the politically easiest low-hanging fruit.
And Richard?
Yes, I'll agree with ADUs is often the first step. That's what they did in Minneapolis before they went bolder. But I think the embedded in the question is uh, a uh, a sense that we can't also think big, and I'm going to push back on that. I'm obsessed with Bobby Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy Sr., not Bobby Kennedy Jr. And he brought together working class people across racial lines. What Mike has called solidarity liberalism, and that's what makes this moment one where you can see something bold happen in housing. Uh, the uh, the Bobby Kennedy Coalition often, almost never happens in America, but it's beginning to happen around housing. When legislation passed in California, when it passed in Oregon, the similar dynamic in Houston and Massachusetts, it was working class people across racial lines who came together and recognized that, the exclusionary zoning is a class phenomenon much more than a racial phenomenon today, and therefore there are interesting possibilities of for bold change, not just. I'd like us to think bigger than bigger and beyond ADUs.
Well, you guys did a nice job answering that tersely, so I will let you get a little bigger. I'll let you get all the way big enough for federal because Benjamin has a nice follow-up here I'd like to give time for before we close out. What would each of you be up to? What would we see under HUD Secretary Kishi, Kallenberg, or Lind? What would be your first priority if you were running the federal response to housing? I'll take it in that order from HUD Secretary Kishi, then Kallenberg, then Lind.
Another kind of interesting question, because I do think that, in terms of like HUD's portfolio and authorities, there are not a lot of obvious federal levers to pull. I think that there are like always congressional proposals to sort of tie transportation dollars to sort of, zoning reform and land use reforms. Again, I guess sort of the aversion towards sort of a federal solution to sort of problems that are sort of inherently at the community level. I don't have a good answer, and therefore I probably will never be the secretary of HUD.
All right, Secretary Kallenberg.
Um, Well, I have as I mentioned, I've got a legislative idea. These days, everything seems to be done by executive order, so who knows? But I've been working with Congressman Cleaver on an economic fair housing act, which would recognize that just as racial discrimination was and is morally wrong, it's morally wrong for a community to pass laws that try to exclude people of modest means, which is what most zoning laws do. So I couldn't do it as Secretary of HUD, but I would. Well, I guess what I would do as Secretary is work with the Congress to pass an economic fair housing act that would recognize that racism is worse than snobbery, but the racist and snob are cut from the same cloth. They're both saying, we have to have local laws that consider some people beneath others, and I'd like to see a culture change over the long term where that class discrimination would be seen as wrong, just as race discrimination is wrong.
All right, and Secretary Lind, what would we see in your first 100 days as Secretary of HUD?
Well, if I were Secretary of HUD, I would abdicate and call for Congress to abolish my department because I'm not convinced we need to have a federal housing policy. And I'm very liberal social democratic on some issues. The federal government is very good in taxing people and redistributing income through Social Security, writing checks. That works. I think it should have general revenue, tax people, write checks to local cities, and then let them do what they want to with it. But we have 340 million people. The United States is the third most populous country on earth after India and China. And I don't think China and India can be run by the center with a one size fits all, policy dictating what you can and cannot do with your neighborhoods, whether it's done through litigation or whatever. So I think the real problem in this country is all of local government civic engagement is withering away. And if we immediately go to Washington for solutions, to the extent I'm not disputing that these are problems of the kind that Richard has discussed, but let's work with it at the city council level and the county commission level before we bring in Washington, D.C.
Well, on that note, I want to thank all of our panelists. I'm going to turn things over for a moment to Julius to talk about other programs coming up for American Affairs. And I will just say, I couldn't have been happier to be moderating this today, the same day that I went over plans for something that superficially resembles an ADU, but it's definitely legally not an ADU based on the strong local government where I live. Thank you so much. I'll turn it over to Julius.
Thanks again, everyone, for joining this event. There's a lot of discussions around housing today. Hopefully, this one was a little different, and hopefully, we can continue these conversations in the future. And just in terms of upcoming programming, we have our next issue, the fall 2025 issue, will be out August 20th. And stay tuned for additional events and webinars and the like. Thanks again, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.